Suddenly look nervous. It's because the only person on the planet who calls me Elizabeth is my mother, and I've usually done something terribly wrong just beforehand. So thanks for having me here to give this talk. It's actually going to represent lessons from a body of work that's more than 20 years old across quite a large number of people in Australia and elsewhere. And it's about, yes, there's devil in the detail, but it is both easy and hard. So to set a little bit of context for that, I think we all know about the Anthropocene now, that the amount of flick up we've seen in the various different properties of the system since the 1950s. That's as true in the oceans as anywhere else. It's happened a little bit later in the oceans. In fact, some of them argue that we're in the middle of our great acceleration right now, where we're just on the upswing of those different parts of the system. How much it'll transfer through time into this world is still a bit of science fiction, probably, a bit of imagination. But we are going from a hunter-gatherer society and transitioning into what the land was probably about 150 years ago. So we're becoming a much more cultured part. So can we, through the use of socio-ecological systems, actually put ourselves in a better place to cope with that than what we did on land, so that we avoid making some of the same mistakes? So one of the ways of doing that is to think about cumulative risk. And that's probably one of the major challenges to socioecology and listening to not just yesterday, but across the last few years. How to do that well, actually, to look at cumulative risk. And one way that people have tended to do is just to look at individual instances of something, or then to start to layer things up. This is an example from the Great Barrier Reef. It's a very good first step to thinking about that problem and how it can be additively comes about or multiplicative. But the core about doing socio-ecological systems is we have to go a little bit further. This is an example from the banking sector where they looked at the risk inside Mexican banks. So the different kinds of banks have different roles in the system and different properties of banking that they look after. No one had actually previously looked at the combined risk in the Mexican banking system. If you looked at just any one layer by itself, you underestimated systemic risk by 90%. And even just doing that layering that we're starting to do in the marine world, where you add up the different layers, you still didn't get to the systemic risk, which was always much higher because of extra interactions in the system. So it pays to see if that's going to be true for us as well as for others. So what I did was I went back to some work we'd already previously done in Australia, where we tried to project what the future of Australia's southeast fisheries would be, taking a socio-ecological view. So we didn't just model the fisheries of this region of Australia. We did have the full ecosystem. We had the climate drivers under different RCP projections about the level of emissions. We had production changes, ecosystem changes, a fully dynamic fleet dynamics model with quota trading and dynamic management feedback decisions. But we also modelled what was happening to the coastal populations, the land use, the other industries that are moving out into the ocean, such as aggregate mining and shipping, increased shipping, aquaculture, that kind of stuff. And we looked at projecting that forward. So I took that data as if it was the real world, and I did the same kind of risk layering. So if you just look at the level of a single failure in that system, so what's the probability of any one, say, species falling out of the system? It was quite low. But if we start to sum over species, you can see it's starting to creep up. And if you did the same processes they did in the banking sector of doing some of their steps to get to their cumulative risk, you saw that it was as much as 10 times higher. So that same 90% underestimate was happening in our world as it happened in the banking world. However, if you went one step forward and said, taking into account interactions between both the human part of the system and the biological part of the system, what was the risk that at least one part of it would fail at some point? And it's actually 100%. Because of the extra dynamics of the interactions in the system. The main difference between the RCPs was the speed with which that happened. It's a lot faster the more extreme the emissions. The way that expressed itself was through the response to different management options. So if we look at the different, you've got the triple bottom line objectives, the ecological, the economic and the social, and different management objectives deal with those to differing degrees. So doing nothing pretty much does nothing. It doesn't satisfy anything, though it does come with its own costs. Then if you take a single sector focus or you start to use spatial or temporal management, There's lots and lots of different forms of management, but the only one that was fairly good for all, across all of these objectives, was if you had truly integrated management across all of the sectors, not just with the sectors within fishery, the different fleets, but all of the sectors in the marine system together. And the reason that that proved to be important rolling forward was because under climate change, the pressure and the performance on those actually increased to depress it. So effectively, by the time you had extreme emissions, you might as well be doing nothing, because if you weren't doing integrated management, all of these other ones had been pushed down to about the same level as doing nothing. So you needed integrated management to cope with the additional stress that was coming with global change. If you then start to unpack where the adaptive capacity was showing up in the model, it was actually only under the higher emission scenarios that the biological system started to fail. So it's so used to things changing over geological timescales, decadal timescales, that the system can largely cope. Evolution, that's been around for quite a while. It does seem to be a pretty good mechanism. And so it was only under extreme emissions that those processes of acclimation and evolution were overwhelmed. But if you look in the human parts of the system, they were having problems right from the get-go. Pretty much most of the barriers that we found were actually in the human parts. And you can see that here, in that these aren't broken out because I'm a human. These are because they were just different categories that really came up as being structurally different in how they created a barrier in the system. So some of these around just simply a human's inability to change their behaviour patterns, our personality and an inflexibility, what our mental models tell us to do versus what we actually should be doing, how rigid and static the governance structure is. Most of the legal laws assume one particular reasoning. So, for instance, if there's a reduction in a fish stock in Australia, it's effectively automatically assumed to be fishing, whether it's a climate-induced rain shift or not. There's a lot of static processes that sit behind even very good management, some of which can be made more adaptive if we really thought about it. There's quite a lot of the economics and markets that can accidentally create perverse incentives, so make you maladaptive, in that what works to get you the most profits today might actually lead to poor behaviours in terms of adapting to a changing future. For instance, it's very hard, being brought up as an Australian, I still don't eat very small forage fish, for instance. Sardines and anchovies weren't something that humans ate, they were for other animals, which is something that's culturally changing very slowly in Australia, but would obviously constrain the market if that was something that we actually needed to consume more of. Technologically and scientifically, there's also a problem too, in that some required technologies don't exist, and scientific understanding is still a hole, which can fundamentally undermine the whole process if you don't quite know where you should be going in the first place. That brings us on to the broader roles of humans and human processes in the concept of adaptation. So we might like to think that innovation is all based around creativity and visions and ideas, and if you do a Google search looking for an image of innovation, that's what you get. But fundamentally, it's actually much more conditioned by all the other processes that are sitting behind it. In particular, looking at the most vulnerable places in the world from a socio-ecological perspective, the developing nations, things that constrain innovation there are actually around some of that economic instruments of what's giving people the freedom to explore that innovation, the available technologies, but most importantly of all is institutions. And this is where the socio-ecological system comes to a head. Good governance and transparency prove to be one of the most important things in getting adaptive capacity to happen. And the reason for that is it's very hard to be the one fish going in the opposite direction. The existing institutions tend to make us very highly conservative. They constrain the options, they reduce... People don't like taking risks most often, particularly big businesses. They like to go with the flow. So that's why institutions can have such a big impact on what shapes adaptation. And that's ultimately why we need to do the modelling. I am getting around to the point around modelling. And this is something we're already starting to see. If you need to think about a bit more broadly than casting things just in economic terms or just in biological terms, this example in Torres Strait, done by colleagues at the CSIRO, Eva couldn't be here. She's getting ready to go to Madagascar to spread her wisdom. But Ingrid is here, so if you want to chase up on particular details, I'd encourage you to talk to Ingrid Van Putten. So they, in a much broader group, went up to the Torres Strait, which is the set of islands between Papua New Guinea and Australia, and they looked at the tropical rock lobster fishery that's up there. They used models, both qualitative conceptual drawing models and Bayesian belief models, to look at how that fishery operated. What were all the drivers that saw that fishery track through? And yes, there was some to do with lobster abundance and with the climate and those kind of things, but most of them are actually to do with cost and culture and prices and the kind of things that sit more in the human realm. Now, lots of people were trying to get all of Australia's fisheries on the same kind of footing, which is an admirable goal, but there was a little bit of inflexibility about the kinds of ideas that they had to achieve that. So it pretty much assumed that economic drivers were the key motivator, and there was actually something quite different. As I think we've heard repeatedly already in this last day, the social side isn't the equal third leg to a stool. It's kind of, if you wanted to sit on that stool, you'd probably topple over because the social isn't so strong, which is something that David Smith has pointed out before. So what they found was that, yes, for those who were full-time fishers who went out all the time, they were profit-driven. They had an additional constraint, though, which was whether they could get their crew to turn up, how much crew was available, and whether they actually had freezer capacity, which can be a bit of a problem in such a remote community. Probably the more important bit was, though, the part-time fishers, who could still make up quite a percentage of that, they started to think about how easy it was to do. Could there be something else that'd get them $1 for the day that wasn't quite as taxing as going fishing, including welfare payments, what's happening in other parts of their diverse livelihood? So it really came down to being a social cultural decision about what they were doing. It wasn't purely economics. It was a bit about having fun, what the rest of the family's doing, that kind of stuff. And that's what we find increasingly as you look through all the neurology literature, the psychology, that what makes us set up a decision has very little to do with economics. There's a whole bunch of other things that motivate us, including whether we're happy. We make more risk-averse decisions when we're in a happy mood than when we're in a sad mood. If you look through the papers on judgments in the court system, if you're ever in trouble, please make sure the judge is well fed before he makes a decision on you. He'll go a lot more leniently. There's an influence of gender, whether you're left or right-wing politics, the culture you're from, even the kind of political system you've grown up in, personality, whether you're patient or an optimist. They all change the way that we make decisions, even seemingly very odd things. So there's terrific experiments about whether, if you look at the last number on your identity card and then go to guess the estimate of a house, it'll be quite highly influenced by whether the number on your identity card is a low number or a high number. So these two completely independent things can be influenced just by the order that they're seen in. So that makes it sound like humans are a very, very complicated thing. But the fact is, it's a bit like the law of large numbers. There's such a large flux in those things that you can get classes of people. So that makes it actually a tractable problem. So the way to think about people and tackling modelling people is the way that we think about the weather and the climate. Yes, the individual actions of a single individual are incredibly hard to predict. They've taken a century to get weather models right. That's kind of the same idea. Where climate, they were getting right over 150 years ago, in effect. And that's what you can do with humans as well. You can get the broad human climate correct most of the time. If it didn't, advertising wouldn't work. So if we think then about making models, we can also think about the history of using the system in total. So if we look at the exploitation of the oceans, it largely started with transport or fishing and has grown through time, and this picture's from NOAA, so thank you, NOAA, for that. It largely grew through time for the single species up to more species to all of the different things that we face today. And you can see that in the legislation as well. It's largely gone from just worried about a single resource to an ecosystem approach to fishing, for instance, and then EBFM and EBM. And that's true of any sector, that it goes from concentrating purely on itself to thinking a little bit about what influences, to thinking about the big, broad picture. If you look around the world, there's actually only one Ministry of the Sea right now, and that's in France. there has been 3 other ministries around the world in the last 100 years that were Ministry of the Sea. All of them have now gone, where about 10% of the world actually reflects the oceans through capturing them as aspects of other industries. So 10% of the world has a fisheries ministry stuck into livestock or trade or tourism or agriculture. But 90% hasn't even do that. They don't see the ocean as something distinct, which means that we can learn from the way the land has worked as well, which is good for modelling as well as for learning lessons in general. So the modelling world has followed the same kind of progression, from looking at single aspects of the system up to their drivers to the more integrated part. So typically most modellers in the marine world have been biologists, so they've come from an ecosystem perspective. And we're just starting to get into that integrated world. So it's not surprising that there's not a huge number of examples about yet, because in reality we're just infants tottering about. We're just getting our legs. If we look at the individual components, you know, at that level we've pretty much knocked off everything in the biological world. There's examples to draw on from everywhere up there. But the same is actually true for the human world if you look around. There's only one sort of existing whole, is how do you model institutions and the turnover in governance? And I'll preface that by saying that's based on the search terms that an ex-biologist, go-on modeller, looks for. So it may well be I'm using the wrong words, and so that's another reason that the disciplines have to come together, because we all spend 10 years getting taught how to speak our own funny version of the language, which can be completely impenetrable to someone from another part. So we need to work together to make sure we're using the right search terms. It may be that there's a huge amount of information out there on this, I just can't find it. So the ultimate goal for doing these kinds of models is to get a self-supporting integrated system, right? Unfortunately, what tends to happen is it looks like this, is you kind of balance up everything you can do. If you're a bit like me building things, there's bits left over. In fact, if you code like me, it doesn't look so good at all. So that's the usual experience, but that's learning, I think. I think we'll get to Da Vinci's bridge. We're just going to take a little while to get there. So that would be my first point, is that it's easy. And that's the point I'd really like you to take home. That it's easy. Just get in there and do it. So, and I would disagree with this picture. I don't think that there is a purity of fields. I think it's much more like this, that you can use maths and models to explain all of the other sciences equally, and that's why integration can happen. So I could happily sit down now, because it is easy. Just don't be afraid. Embrace your inner child, leap in and do it. Occasionally you'll blow your own feet off, but you learn when you make mistakes. So don't be afraid to fall flat in your face, basically, and then you'll be happy doing socio-ecological modelling. If you're a bit more worried about your reputation, then there's a few lessons that you should probably stick around for. But before we get to those, the important part about all models is that they bring different sources of information together. So this can be pure scientific data, but also using models allows you to access a much broader spectrum of knowledge types. And for true success in this field, you really need to pull those together. Plus, there's not just one model. You won't see the name of a single model anywhere in this, because there's lots of different kinds of models and they all have equal value. And you have to sort of get past the "my model's better than yours" syndrome. Part of that is so that we can borrow. So there's many different parts of the innovation cycle, from borrowing and copying and imitation up to generation of truly new things. And that's true for any kind of innovation, and modelling's no different. I'd say that in the terms of socio-ecological, there's a lot to be done right here about borrowing from another discipline or from another experience, from complex adaptive systems or from business or whatever, and bringing that across, but equally to listen to each other. You can get quite a lot from just taking what's already there and trying to bolt it together, but also saying, I have a hammer. What else can I do with this hammer? Or they've got a screwdriver. What if I tried a screwdriver over here? So that you can accept things in, you can take things out. You don't always assume that just the way that you've been taught is the way to do it. And that's true now that we have such a long range. There's probably even more different types of models here. These are all the ones that I use on a regular basis. And I'd just really like to stress that even this kind of modelling, which was for a long time, erroneously considered second stage is actually one of the most important kinds of modelling. It's called sign diagraphs. It's just showing where the positive and negative connections in the system are. But you can go a whole huge way into looking at perturbation effects, indirect effects, transitions, just by doing that. And it's something you can literally do in the very simplest case. I think we've drawn one up in about 10 minutes. In other times it can take a whole day. But it also allows people to access all of those different kinds of knowledge types. And Jeff Dambacher, who's sort of the king of this kind of modelling, is here. So again, he's someone else I'd encourage you to talk about. Another way of thinking about it is what we call agent-based modelling isn't just the individual-based modelling from economics or social sciences. It's been mathematically shown that agent-based modelling subsumes all the rest of these. So you can actually use these kinds of models as agents in a bigger agent-based model. So you can actually plug and play directly the different kinds of models to make the most use of them. Now, that's all been a rosy story. Life isn't actually that linear. There will be lots of dead ends, and okay, this is the hard part. So linking subsystems is really important. So you've actually got to have more than just one-way coupling, which is something that humans aren't very good at. So this is an example from southeast of Australia where we looked at alternative management strategies. If you just do a fishing mortality forcing on that ecosystem, or if you ask experts on that ecosystem, because humans tend to be fairly linear thinkers, the best that they could come up with regard to management was to take existing well-proven management tools, such as quotas and economic levers, and use them broadly across the whole system, and that would have improved the economic state and the ecological state, was their anticipation. And about 85% of the time they're probably right, but where it differed and where some of the big surprises and performance lay was actually once you started to bring in the rest of the system. Once you had those feedbacks in, you actually found that quite a diversity of approaches were required, and that's where the two-way coupling became important. The feedback, it's not just a linear pressure from humans onto the ecosystem, it's feedbacks within the human system, it's feedbacks within the ecosystem. All of those combined meant that you had to use a diversity of tools if you're going to meet the diversity of objectives, even within just fisheries, let alone by the time you go to across industries, which can have very conflicting objectives. The next one is also related to connections, but mainly to do with scale. So the guys who've looked at resilience have thought about the world quite a lot at different scales and in different boxes. We actually expand that out a bit to what you saw. Jess Melbourne-Thomas is one of the people who've been working on this, as you heard in a talk yesterday. You can bin different processes and different units into those different scales. This is just one set of connections. And then you can trace, a bit like a kid's snakes and ladders games. You can trace what's connected to what to pull out what the drivers in a particular system are. So if we try to do that for socio-ecological system, actually the physical world reckon that they've done this pretty well. They already do nesting between the different stages. You'll notice that their regions are already pretty small. They've kind of fudged the regional ability, but they do this nesting. And the physics world is probably one we can learn some lessons from on how to do that nesting, but in reality their situation is a whole lot simpler than ours. They don't like to hear that, but it is actually the truth. We can take lessons from there, but they've got the easy ride. This patch here this coloured box should actually go over. We're okay on the local to individual scales for these kind of things. We've been modelling for a while. We do very well at the global scale, but there's a bit of a gap here in the intermediate area. And you'll notice there's also this huge gap on the social side. So that's because we're really only starting to do explicit models. There's been lots of descriptive models, but explicit models are coming, and that's something that was recognised in the 1980s by a guy that was, very influential in the systems dynamic world. He effectively invented parts of it. He'd seen that the last century effectively had been about understanding the biophysical world, and the next century for him would be about understanding the social world and the social systems, and I think that's pretty true. So if we think about this gap, though, it appears that there's fundamentally a gap, particularly around modelling regional parts, and that's where some of the biggest headaches in modelling can come from. So you're not going to hear a lot about biophysical modelling from me here, that there's quite a lot of lessons that already exist from that. And it took me 10 years to get the biophysical complications down, but it's taken the next 10 years to just scratch the surface on the human parts, largely because we're often being asked questions at the regional scale for humans in doing management questions, and that's actually one of the poorly represented scales. Even biophysically, it's very data poor at this scale, it's very noisy, and when you can start to unpack what that noise is about, it's because it's a region of process overlap. So at the very small scales, there's very clear processes. At the global scale, all the processes have kind of been smeared out or have their own actual global influence. Whereas in the regional scale, there's an overlap, so it's very hard to tease apart. So it's just really a mess. There's no clear signals that like you get at the local and at the global scale, which then influence your management success. Dealing with those cross scales then makes it really hard to do well. But we need to try and understand it, even if we don't model explicitly the regional models, so that we can look up and down and make cleaner linkages across the different parts of the system. So you might not want to explicitly do that nesting the physical modelers do, but you need to at least think about where things at larger scales are influencing the scale that you're interested in, or things at smaller scales are influencing up. So we're very good at doing subgrid scale processes, about taking a step back and capturing in an abstract way what's happening at a lower scale, but we need to be doing the reverse as well. Now that gets a bit complicated because you start to look at processes that you're not familiar with, and the assumption is that the more you know, the more that you want to stick in a model. So that's the one I usually get accused of, is you just know about stuff so you stick it in there because you think it's going to be important. It's not actually true. The most useful models sit in the middle. So if you think about a map, a blank map's no good, but a really complicated map that's as complicated as the real world isn't very good either. You want something in the middle. What we find is that once you actually start to know about a system, you get a bifurcation in the response. It has a lot to do with the personality of the person. People who synthesise information don't mind sticking around this midpoint or actually going a bit simpler. It's only the reductionists who push through to wanting to put in all the extra details. Interestingly enough, at the very simplest end, because we know a little bit about what we know, we try to just suddenly linearly extrapolate that to everything we don't know. We suddenly assume that you have to put in lots and lots of information, so it's going to be too complicated. Let's just give up and go home now. It's actually once you start to learn more that you're more comfortable with heading for this bifurcation point. So it can be hard to take people along the modelling route, and I'm forever being told that we won't be able to model humans, it's far too complicated. But that's because we're trying to take our little knowledge about the individual interactions that we know well and suddenly explode it to large scales without realising synthesis is possible. So there are some ideas about how to model people. This is kind of the Fulton version of what that breaks down to. So there's some basic collective needs that we all have. There's some actors or location or contextual needs around that. So at the present moment, I want to be fed. I want to make sure I don't get too lost, but I also need to know what's happening with the family. And there's the uncontrollable things like losing your luggage or having a big financial crisis happen. There's not too much I could do about a big financial crisis, so they're just sort of out there in the bigger wide world. And all of those influence your experience and your responses. So once you start to break it down, the same way you'd break down thinking about any other problem, it starts to become a lot easier to do. This is an example of an agent-based model at a fine scale from the northwest of Australia, where we had different behaviours happening both within the biological side and the human side, but under fairly simple rules. You got emergent patterns of behaviour, like the guy going down to work, the tourists starting for their morning swim on the beach and then coming back to write their science paper, Fabio, so that we could represent the different tourists and residents happening in the area and look at what different coastal planning would do there. So in doing that, we learn a lot about different scales and representing human behaviour. But you can also look at very global properties. So Rich Little, who's also in the audience here, has looked at some of this behaviour sharing with agent-based models or simple models of humans. He looked at the efficiency and sustainability of fishing based on the sharing of information. So if you have a group of people in a network, how they share information can be really important to the sustainability of the system. If it's too efficient and too well connected, this resource is actually unsustainable because there's nowhere for the fish to hide effectively. On the opposite, if everyone lies and no one trusts anyone and no one shares the information, that's not sustainable either because no one can find the resource at all. It's actually a little bit of inefficiency, which is an interesting word to be heard in the current world of trying to optimise efficiency. A little bit of inefficiency actually makes the whole thing sustainable. And this kind of lessons, these kinds of models are being picked up the world over. In business and defence, in health, this is a model of epidemics, for instance. They're learning it, and the business world is a place to look for some of these lessons to bring over into our models, because they're learning it in a big way. Procter & Gamble now saves themselves $3 million a year in their life cycle, in their delivery cycle, because they did some agent-based modelling that broke away from pure economics to understand their delivery system. The other good thing about modelling people is that there's lots of different ways of doing it. So this is an example of all the different kinds of information types you can use to build up an agent-based model, remembering agents can be statistical or empirical or differential equations, as well as those decision rule models. So there's surveys, there's literature, there's role-playing games, there's interviews. There's lots of different ways of collecting information. So if we think of each one of these as a dot on a map, then we modelled this as the coast where we did the agent-based modelling. You can see that for all the different industries we represented, they're represented in very different ways. So that's the value of bringing all those different approaches together. So yes, it's hard to maybe get your head around some of those, and yes, it's hard to get some of the data in some instances, but it can be done, and it's actually quite a lot of fun to see the way that it can be done in different ways. And it can be very participatory as well, with having conversations with people to fill some of this out. So that gets us on to the trickiest and hardest part of doing it all, is modelling institutions. So the cartoonist, I think, grabbed it pretty well yesterday. This is actually a picture I used to try and explain coastal management in Australia. It's a bit like a 2-year-old. Oh, bright, shiny, mine, broken. No, that's yours. And so you can start to look at what institutions are like. They are where the fuzziest parts of being humans come together. There's a lot of informal institutions as well as formal ones. But it's worth including them in the model so that you can explore their adaptive capacity. What are your options given institutions? What will actually work? What will hit a wall? But also, when do institutions actually need to change, which is ultimately probably going to be our hardest job. And it's actually already starting to have taught us some lessons. So if we look at the current picture of what we think ecosystem-based management came from, it's seen its own evolution, because in David's experience, he sort of lived it. In my experience, I was playing with models. So the models actually leaped to saying a truly integrated, overarching institution is the best way of tackling management. And then you put in the human parts of the system behind that. So if you abstractly represent institutes, that's what you get. If you put into account that you have politicians and public servants, and there's been a history and a path dependency in the institutions we have, you'll find that that's actually impossible to get to. So that this becomes the pragmatic solution. It's the sort of the second step mathematical solution, but in the agent-based models, it's the only pragmatic outcome that actually survives. And that's to say, to fundamentally pick on the fact that you can't solve the interconnection problems without being integrated. That's the bit we started way back when. This is the part that's going to help prop us up against global change. That we need these extra bits kept spare, because that's where the legacy is, that's where people's self-interest is, in that bureaucrats and scientists and everybody else in the system are human too, so you can't fight their intentions or desires any more than anything else. So this might be the practical way forward. There's lots of uncertainties around that though. There's parametric uncertainty that we probably hear most about. There's structural uncertainty about how the system's tied together, which probably doesn't get as much exploration as it should in the modelling. But these are effectively the known unknowns. We know that we have problems with those kinds of uncertainty. The harder ones to try and deal with are the unexpected, the extreme events and the step changes. And part of this comes from what was termed amistics, from thinking about Amish people, by a science fiction author. So right before when my father was a child, the human brain likes to imagine what the future will be like, but it kind of just takes, again, very linearly, takes the day and shoots it forward. So we've heard lots and lots of stories about flying cars. You know, lots of the Jetsons, lots of old movies had flying cars as being the future. It wasn't until fairly recently we realised it wasn't about moving us, it was about moving the information. We're now much more globally interconnected because we virtually move around the globe. We don't necessarily physically fly around the globe. And that kind of step change has been very different to what we anticipated. So this is where the role of scenarios and storytelling can really come hand in hand with socio-ecological systems. It's accessing a different kind of knowledge. And if you really want to have someone in your scenario group who's going to pose the kinds of step changes that we really see, employ a science fiction author. So they have the scientific basis for internal consistency, but they can let their imagination run wild. There was a process in the 1990s where the UN tried to project what the world would look like in 2050. They asked people on the street, they asked experts, they asked science fiction authors, and the science fiction authors have got the transition closest to date. So this comes to the tools that you use. So I'm about to suggest a couple of tools that I find incredibly handy, but we need to remember that tools are tools. They can be used and misused. What I find useful about management strategy evaluation is it helps you to explore some of these ideas. So what it does is it captures that whole interacting. So you have the people outside the system, the non-modellers, define what their objectives are. Inside the model, you model that socio-ecological system. So it can be a single stock, it can be an ecosystem, it can be the whole socio-ecological system sitting up here. Then you've got the management process. I come from looking at management questions, but it's whatever human process that you're trying to think about here as well. So you do all that in here, then you look at the different outcomes and what worked and what didn't. It's just a tool, okay? It's a useful tool because it lets you explore not only your primary uncertainties, but to chuck in to see how robust you are to unlikely scenarios. Depending on how you use it, you can use it in forecast mode, you can use it in understanding mode. I tend to be more in the understanding mode. This is an example from a reef system in Australia, again by Rich Little, where it just looked at the potential outcomes under different management objectives given a whole range of uncertainties. And that's a useful tool that can be quite useful in dealing with a lot of the problems that we've seen. The other thing to remember is that you should always use multiple models, even within an MSE context or much, much broader. All models are lies. They're just our stories about how we interpret the world as working. You're after just capturing the essence of what's there in a model. So there's multiple different parts to that story. And as soon as you accept that the truth is in the intersection of independent lies, as Levin said, or you accept that there's not one true model, that they're all just partial stories, partial paintings, then you're much happier with the idea that you can use lots of different models and you can use them in lots of different ways. So that you've got forecast and understanding, yes, that's a useful model, but you don't take the same mindset into asking other questions. So after the global financial crisis, and a couple of journalists in particular asked me, why the hell do we keep modelling? You guys destroyed the world. You've caused this whole huge economic meltdown. That's because your forecasts aren't very right. Well, that's because we were asking the wrong questions of those models. Models fundamentally in socio-ecological systems help understanding. Even if they can't perfectly project exactly what's going to happen, they help us unpick and understand what's going on, and that's the key part of doing this. So that's why stepping out and having a go is important, even if you make a mistake, because we learn from those mistakes. We learn more about the overarching system. And that's why it has to be multidisciplinary as well, so that the different parts and different models and the different disciplines can act together to have their different stories come together, so that you can embrace all of the different perspectives and the different insights that you're getting. Okay, but you do have to do this practically. For anyone who knows me, they're about to laugh when I suggest that you actually have to make sure it's not the most complicated thing on the planet. I'm pretty sure everyone thinks I aim to do this. In my head, I still am trying to do this. So you have to keep your expectations under control. Eva Plagani is very good at this. She's very good at describing this. This is another example from Australia. So even if you're going to do a forecast model or a very tiny constrained model, in my experience it works very well to think as a systems modeller, even if you're not actually going to do a systems model. So think broadly so that you've got that bigger socio-ecological process in part. That can be hard to do. It can be one of the harder things if you're not used to it. But if you just let your imagination run wild, imagine you're a little kid who wants to draw a picture of the system. What kind of things would you include? And then you can go out and pick the key plays. In this case, Eva's doing a little bit of a socio-ecological with a biological focus, so there's more here. But you can see her grey amoeba has picked out key plays everywhere. And that's a very useful approach on how to do this. You end up with a level of intermediate complexity that's actually really useful, and it's useful both in tactical and strategic models. If you do it this kind of way, you can do very formal fitting that sits naturally within the existing management cycles and what they expect to see out of a model, but can also allow for broad thinking and bring in new concepts. So Ingrid will talk later in the week about how to bring a sense of place even into these kinds of models, so that you can start to capture some of those very unusual aspects of being a human and what we identify with and what, why we live in places that we do. Then ultimately, the very, very hardest part about being a socio-ecological modeller is actually getting people to use what you've done. But a large part of that is because everybody is very busy these days. They don't have time for extra things, and they don't see that there's a lot of extra resources. But if you can get past that, then you have the problem of inappropriate trust. So on the one side, you've got people who trust too much, and you have to spend all your time saying, it's not a crystal ball, it's not the real world, it's just a model. Keep yourself under control there. They can actually be very enthusiastic, but you do need to keep them under control. Things can go badly wrong if you let them have their head. The ones we're more used to hearing from are those who trust too little. So quite a lot of those will be scientists who have a very, very detailed view of their part of the world and can't see where some of the synthesis comes from. But it's also from people who don't recognise that they're modelling all the time. Being alive is being a modeller. You don't put your hand on a hot stove because you think it's going to burn you. That's using a model. So as soon as someone says, I'm not a modeller, it's like, no, you really are. We just have to recognise that you're being a modeller. Yeah, we tend to trust our mental models quite explicitly, but they're a very fuzzy mix of emotion and function. They're not very clear, they're not typically internally consistent, and they're also very static. We can have one picture of the past, one picture of today, and one picture of the future that are from 3 different worlds of physics. It's kind of like having the multiple universe theory all in once in your head. So trying to get past some of that is a bit difficult, but it can be done. Some of the things that you'll hit the most, though, is around the familiarity and trust. So, for instance, I've had quite a number of senior public servants say to me, oh, your projections are rubbish, I don't trust models. The economic projections say, so they don't recognise that, they either don't recognise that economic projections are models, or they're just so familiar with them that they've become an accepted part of their mental models. So we have to, as modellers, it can be a bit hard if you're an introvert and not into socialising, to have that warmth, to have those conversations, but we really need to do that to build up some of the human trust. It is very easy to blame the modeller. If you look at the collapse of past fisheries, it's usually the modellers who get the blame. It's because nerds still aren't cool, despite all the TV shows that try to show the opposite. And science, one thing that we're starting to really hit, particularly in the developed world, is science is just one voice. And so the general public doesn't know how much to trust it compared to other things. So that can really put you behind the 8 ball when you're trying to say, well, but it's something we can use as well, so that you can help them build their own models to see if they represent the reality that they've experienced. And when they do that, then they start to appreciate their mental models might have some flaws. The other one that's often misunderstood is how the modeller can be the honest broker. You're just saying what the model says. You haven't come in there with an agenda. Typically, you get told that you're in whatever dislike group of their choice at the present moment. That means that they haven't understood your role or the role of models. So that just takes a bit of patience to get past. So in summary, models are about training your brain effectively, so they help us look at the different parts of the world. It's a very crowded space now with conflicting objectives, so it's really important that we do this. And maths, whether that's formal mathematics that looks like flute music or whether that's mathematics done in step diagrams, is all really important to unpacking that sociological system. They're about synthesising information and providing options. But there are challenges around that. At scales we don't yet have a lot of information on, or components we're just starting to tease out. Alternative methods are probably required. We don't have every method that's ever going to be invented around yet, so keep your eyes open, be willing to cross-fertilise. But it's equally, because we're working in a sociological system as well, we have to build trust and social capacity and human capacity behind using models as well. And that's actually probably the hardest part. But there's no right model. As Billy Christensen loves to say, modeling's not like a religion. You can have more than one. So that you can dive in and just have a go. And that would be my biggest recommendation. And hopefully at the end of this you feel more like her and less like him.